All right, Pixel Poppers. This is the main stage, and welcome to our next talk for the day, which is procedurally generated storytelling in the real world with M. Lazer-Walker. M is a Toronto-based artist engineer who makes interactive art, experimental games, software tools. Most of her work focuses on non-traditional interfaces to reframe everyday objects as spaces and playful experiences. Welcome M to the stage.
Hey everybody, how's it going? As Jordan just said, my name is M. I use she, her, they, them pronouns. I work as a cloud advocate at Microsoft, which, separate from this talk, means please come talk to me about Azure. Specifically, as a quick plug, I would love to talk to you about PlayFab, which is Microsoft's cloud gaming thing. It gets pitched as tools for MMOs and free-to-play games, but it's actually a really easy way for you to add things like leaderboards and real-time analytics to your indie game for usually free. But sorry about that. My name is M. So I'm here to talk to you not about that, but about the sorts of experimental games and interactive art that I make that use non-traditional interfaces to connect people to the world, like this piece called Computational Flâneur. This is a site-specific generative poetry walk I built for the Come Out and Play Festival in San Francisco. That means this is an app that you download onto your phone. You go to Fort Mason, a park in San Francisco, you put your headphones in, and as you wander through the park, a robot reads and makes up and reads you poems based on where you are in the park. So if you wander by the cannons, you'll hear poems about war. If you walk by the waterfront, you'll hear poems of the sea, that sort of thing. So I wanted to talk today about the process of making it. There are a lot of resources out there about how do you do cool things with text generation, but not as much that I've seen about this specific flavor of ProcGen. So specifically, one thing about it is it's interactive. This is not just a Twitter bot that spits out text at you that you consume passively. It is sort of in conversation with you as a player. And that conversation isn't mediated by a mouse and keyboard or a controller or a touch input. It's using real world data. It's using audio as output, and the input are all sorts of things from GPS location to motion coprocessor data to third-party weather APIs, basically anything we can get off the bundle of sensors that you have in your pocket. And so I haven't seen a lot of people talk about specifically thinking about this sort of procedural generation whose output escapes screens. So this talk is going to be in a couple different parts. I'm going to start by talking about the history and tradition of immersive theater and site-specific art installations that computational Flâneur plays into. And specifically looking at the ways the sorts of joyful emergent behaviors they produce actually mirror a lot of what we like about digital procedural generation. I'm going to touch very briefly about the actual text generation part with a specific eye towards using neural network generated text. And then finally, with all of that, talk about computational Flâneur itself and look at the prototyping and design process. What are sort of technical tools and concepts that go into doing this sort of real world work. So if all goes according to plan, besides me having told you about this weird little lovely art piece, you'll have learned a bit about the various methods that we have for designing text, how this sort of world of immersive theater works and how it might relate to this thing, and then a sense of how you can actually design these sorts of generators for interactivity and the real world. So, how many of you in here are familiar with Sleep No More? Great, some of you. This is a theater piece by a British theater troupe called Punch Drunk. I think we're good. It is a piece that's running in New York and Shanghai. It's run in Boston in the past. It is a production that tells the story of Shakespeare's Macbeth and Hitchcock's film Rebecca, but it is not a piece of theater that you sit in a chair and spend 3 hours staring at a proscenium. The set for Sleep No More is a 6 or 7 story building that takes up a whole city block in Manhattan. So this story is told entirely through dance and movement. When you show up, they put one of those white masks on your face and say, don't take it off and don't touch anything, don't say anything, otherwise do whatever you want. So you can spend your 2 or 3 hours at the McKittrick Hotel following a character the whole time, or staying in a room and seeing what characters come in and out, or hanging out in the library and reading books, or in the candy shop and eating candy. And all of these are conceivably valid ways to experience Sleep No More. And so it's this wonderful magical experience. But to me, the real magic isn't in your couple hours in the experience. It is when you go to the bar or the coffee shop after with your friends and debrief and talk about what sort of different, unique experiences you had. Because you will have had different individual experiences, and not just what scenes that I see that you didn't see, or what sequence of events that I get that you got in a slightly different order. You will have had these sort of sequences of things that you saw that feel like this combination in this order was so perfect and so serendipitous that it must have been designed, even though it wasn't. Sleep No More is this gigantic clockwork of staging that it would be fascinating to look at the stage manager's book where every single actor knows exactly where they are at any moment in time. So the fact that you can have these really interesting, essentially player stories, although they wouldn't use that term, emerging out of this rigidly plotted piece of theater is really interesting to me. And specifically so when we think about emergence and emergent behavior in games, we think of it as something like Conway's Game of Life, where the rules for this glider that appears and replicates itself across the screen, nothing in the simple cellular automata rules of Conway's Game of Life suggest it, but it happens. When we talk about that, or sort of emergent gameplay coming out of games that rely heavily on procedural generation, we always assume that this emergence is arising out of the intersection of algorithms, whether it is something like Conway's Game of Life that may not have been replicated by a computer, or the source code that makes up games like Spelunky. But to me, what is interesting about Sleep No More is it captures the same sort of emergence. Instead of this unexpected and interesting behavior coming out of algorithms intersecting, it's coming out of audience members being free to explore the narrative possibility space of this rigidly authored plot, limited only by their ability to move through the physical space. And as a side note, it's worth noting that this works because you are physically there. With any sort of emergent stories like this, the act of it happening to you makes it that much more meaningful. That is why we grasp on so heavily to stories of people playing games with interesting things happening, but that's amplified when you are actually physically doing something rather than just holding a controller and playing a game. That embodiment and physicality matters. This is another piece that less of you may be familiar with. Janet Cardiff is this amazing sound artist who has made a bunch of audio walks. This is one she made in 2004 or 2005 in New York for the Public Art Fund. Where at the time you would rent a cassette tape from her and go on this 30-minute journey through Central Park, where she is telling you stories and there's sort of a framing narrative of why you're walking. But that's really not what the piece is about. The piece is about this binaural audio soundscape that you hear. You'll hear police sirens on 59th Street or a couple arguing behind you, and you won't quite know, is that part of the experience or is that just actually what is happening in real life? And because it's a static recorded audio file, she's using binaural positional audio, so it sounds like it's behind you, but it's baked in, so if you turn your head, that couple arguing moves with you and breaks the illusion. A whole other talk I could give is all of the amazing psychological tricks she uses to make sure you don't turn your head. This is a really, really well-designed piece of art. But what's lasting about it isn't the specifics of the plot arc or even those little moments, but the way it shapes your relationship with the space. It somehow manages to elevate the real world interactions that happen as a result of you walking through the park. If you want to talk about the magic circle of a game or sort of suspending your disbelief in a piece of theater, she somehow manages to extend that to everything that happens in the real world as you are taking a walk in the park, into giving them the sort of vivid and hyper-real sentiment. So my experience doing this and my memories of doing her long black hair make that corner of the park feel so much more vivid and magical and real to me than just doing an audio walk or just walking through the park. And this is all very intentional and very, very good design. The ways that her piece interact with the real world are sort of very, very subtle but clearly intentional. When she plays police sirens on 59th Street, you know that as long as there are cars in New York, there will be police sirens on 59th Street. At one point, she has you walk by the zoo, and she points out some animals, I think the seals that are still there, but then she points out some polar bears that clearly have not been there for at least a decade. I don't know if they actually existed or not when she actually recorded the piece, but the way she frames it, the disconnect between what she is telling you and what is there feels equally meaningful and powerful. And she has all of these other moments where she asks you to sort of make a fool of yourself in public or interact with strangers, where she's trusting that the spontaneity of randomness of the real world is going to do something satisfying and magical and wonderful and tie into this piece. And so to me, this is just like Sleep No More. Not just that it is another embodied work of art, but if Sleep No More is all about you finding your own interesting player stories through physically navigating this highly plotted scenario. This is a little more locked down in that it is a static 25-minute piece of audio that everyone hears the exact same thing, but the interesting emergent behaviors are emerging out of the intersection of that piece of audio and the randomness of the real world and whatever might be happening to you when you're walking through the park. And that is really cool and really interesting to me. And you don't see a lot that plays off of the chaos and unpredictability of what will happen to you in public spaces when you're psychologically primed for it. And it works really well. This is not the point of this talk, but you should absolutely go do this if you find yourself in New York. So that is all to lead us up to. So a couple years ago, I was doing research at the MIT Media Lab all about how can we use fiction to connect people to public spaces and essentially make more things like this. That I've seen people try to do more art-focused audio walks. They don't quite have the magic of Janet Cardiff, and there's not a lot of them, partly because this is a really, really hard design problem. So part of my research hypothesis was if we can find various ways to use technology to make this a little bit easier, then maybe we could see more things like this exist in the world. And so I started out working on more traditional authored narrative works, drawing from things we know from interactive fiction and narrative games, but quickly shrunk it down to focus purely on something less narrative to play around with lower level building blocks. So Come Out and Play that year in San Francisco was in Fort Mason, which is a really, really cool park that I feel like none of my friends had actually spent time in. There is a fort area that's pretty popular. There's a farmer's market and some restaurants and an event space. There's a grassy area that a lot of people hang out in on the weekends. There's also a lot of really weird stuff. There's a chapel, there is a community garden, there are all these winding paths covered in flowers, there are cannons. And my overall design goal became, how can I design something that will help my friends appreciate this space that is sitting in the middle of the city that they have probably not spent much time in? And so I drew inspiration from two very disparate places. The first were Twitter bots, and the sort of pet theory I have of Twitter bots, which is that they are really, really good Skinner boxes or like slot machines. So this Twitter bot on the left here is by Darius Kazemi. It just grabs two headlines from Google News, it swaps the subjects, and the result is sometimes funny, sometimes complete nonsense. But if you say this bot tweets once an hour, if it was funny every time, that would probably be less interesting than here, where you know that sometimes it's gonna be uninteresting garbage, maybe most of the time, but this time, like maybe this time it's gonna be hilarious, and that makes the times it is funny that much more meaningful. On the complete other opposite end of the attention economy, we have meditation chimes. So I'm not an expert at meditation. I apologize if I'm misrepresenting anything, but a tool that I have found valuable are having sort of a sound that plays every so often while you're meditating, since even though in an ideal world you are completely focused on the present and now, we are only human, your attentions are going to wander and start thinking about all of the things that are going on in your life. Counterintuitively, having this external sound helps snap you back to the present and remind you what you're supposed to be doing. So if what's beautiful about Janet Cardiff's piece are these moments where the outside world serendipitously intersects with the recorded audio to make something that feels like it was intentional, you can see that as sort of functioning like one of these Twitter bot Skinner boxes, where Janet Cardiff is putting all of these hooks into the piece, where some of them, but not all of them, are going to resonate with the real world. You could also then imagine that functioning like a meditation chime. If you going for a walk through the park means you're going to be thinking about everything that is going on in your life, which in 2019 is probably a lot, maybe having something like that, these moments of serendipity in what you were listening to, reflecting what you were seeing, can act as a sort of meditation chime and remind you, no, I should be thinking about this park. And what's cool about this idea is I am very much a person who focuses on technology and likes to think about how am I going to write some code to solve this problem. This is an idea where the artistic concept drives the technology rather than the other way around. You could imagine a version that is closer to Janet Cardiff's piece where I just recorded an audio walk or some poetry or something, and I would trust that at some points it would intersect. But if that is the case, and if that is the goal, like a hypothesis is that the more it relates to your experience, the more of these moments of synchrony we create, the stronger the piece is gonna be, the better it's gonna work. So then we have this sort of, not really quantifiable, but maybe qualifiable metric of the ways we can bring in data sensors and things on your phone that will let us know more about what is actually going on. That might let us provide like poetry that more often intersects with the real world in interesting ways. And so for the sake of time, I'm hand-waving over how the actual poetry generation worked. In broad strokes, there's this wonderful artist named Ross Goodwin who was at ITP and did a bunch of beautiful work with computer-generated poetry. He built a camera, for example, that you would take a photo of something, and it would, instead of giving you an image, it would detect what was in the photo and generate you a piece of poetry based on it. And he trained a character-based recurrent neural network on a couple hundred megabytes of 20th century poetry. So long story short, I had this black box that I could give it a couple different inputs and it would spit me out poetry. How do I actually then integrate this with the real world? I'm going to talk about it really quickly because I'm running short on time, a handful of issues I ran into and how I solved them and sort of what that told us about this experience. So my initial hypothesis was more data sensors are better. If I have this thing that I can spit some inputs into and poetry comes out, the more that I can know about what you are doing, the better the experience will be. So I started out with using your location and using how quickly you're moving, using your phone's motion sensors and weather APIs, so I could say, what are the experience you're only going to get if it's raining? Are you there in the morning versus at night, a weekday versus a weekend, summer versus winter? Is it your first time or your 20th time? Are there other people there? And I ran into a very, very common issue with any sort of procedural generation, which is an algorithm that isn't legible might as well be a random number generator. Going through and testing this out myself, even as the person who literally wrote the code to make it work, it made no sense. It turns out this is such a weird new concept that we as humans don't yet have a mental model for. I'm going to be listening to a podcast, but the podcast is going to be different if it's raining. Or I'm listening to music on Spotify that is speeding up as I am running faster. So the result was I had to shrink everything down to the minimum, as simple as possible. All I ended up using was GPS location and your movement speed. So if you think about how this poetry generator actually works, it basically had 3 inputs. You could give it how much text you wanted to produce at once, which for me about 50 characters produced the most interesting text. You have a temperature, so the way these generators work, basically given some text, you're asking a system, statistically speaking, what is the next text that is likely to come after it? And so if you have, like a temperature is basically variance. So a lower temperature means it's going to pick things that are statistically safer, so it's more likely to be coherent but less likely to be interesting. A higher temperature is going to be more interesting, potentially more nonsensical. And then a seed text, so what is the text you're giving it to start out with? So basically what I ended up doing was I created all of these regions in the park. You can see this app that I used on site to generate various regions and associated each of those with maybe 20 or 30 handwritten seed texts. So anytime we need to generate you some poetry, we're going to find out where you are, we're going to grab some text, we're going to derive the temperature from how quickly you're moving, under the assumption that if you're moving really quickly, you're probably just trying to see this and figure out what's going on, so giving you stuff that's more interesting probably makes sense, whereas if you're moving more slowly and more meditatively, you're probably really into it, so giving you things that are a little safer is probably good. And that ended up working really well. The way that I ended up building this and sort of what ended up being essential was this. So this app that I built worked on site in the space. I was walking around tagging things myself and saying this region should be here where I'm physically standing, which worked because for reasons that I don't have time to get into, GPS was absolutely perfect here. I was getting probably 5 meters of accuracy, which if you've ever worked with location in an urban setting is unheard of, but it meant that I could just think about location as an abstract piece of data rather than worrying about the inaccuracy of these physical satellites in space. Skip the stuff that I don't have time to talk about. But ultimately, that worked because I was able to do this sort of testing where I was on site and experiencing this for myself physically in the space, because I did not live in San Francisco at the time, which means that if you're trying to design an experience for a specific space, I needed to be able to make the most of my time there. And so I assume most of the people in this room are used to dealing with software rather than hardware, where there are a lot of different levels of feedback loops you might work with, but they are all relatively constrained. Yes, unit testing is faster than automated testing, is faster than manual QA, is faster than putting software in users' hands and waiting for feedback, but a lot of those are still relatively within the same time frame. Whereas with hardware and physical real world things, me having to go outside of my apartment to walk around to test things is way slower than waiting a couple weeks for me to be in San Francisco to actually physically test this. So I needed to very consciously think about what are the things that I can test at different levels. So it was super important that at any time I could run the poetry generator on the command line and play around with what are the seed texts and how do they feel. It was super important that I had a build of the app that I could just go and listen to poetry wherever I was walking to feel out what is the aesthetic experience of walking while a robot reads out poetry to you, and press a button to feel what it feels like to change regions, so that then I could make the most of this in-person time, which in the early stages meant playing around with high-level questions like what sensors are legible. Turns out none of them. Things like what are these regions, what are the intersections between the regions, which ended up requiring a lot of subtle work. Like some regions I crossfade between what sort of poetry you're getting. Some regions have like, here is a specific piece of text that represents transitioning between regions, that sort of thing. But then later on it became essential for fine-tuned details. Like there are things like tweaking those regions. There were some subtle background audio bits, like Jane at Cardiff, like when you're in the community garden, you hear birds chirping. When you're by the chapel, you hear bells playing. That stuff, my first stab at that was completely overwrought and unusable. And it was only through going to the park, listening to things, sitting down on a bench, and trying new things that I was able to figure it out. So the piece would have been completely unsubtle and not interesting if I hadn't been able to spend time focusing on the little details, which I couldn't have done if I hadn't consciously designed a design process that meant that I could spend the time on the physical site doing the things that matter. So it goes without saying that all of this is much more painful than just building a Twitter bot or a walking simulator. So why even bother? And to me, as an artist, like I'm really interested in the way you interact with the system affects your emotional response to it. You feel very different about playing a game on a controller versus playing it on your smartphone with a touchscreen versus mouse and keyboard, even separate from whether the touch controls are uncomfortable. You feel different about even like using your computer, or you using an Apple like chiclet keyboard versus a clacky, juicy mechanical keyboard. And so as an artist who is interested in playing with the emotional response of people engaging with your art, that is a really interesting palette to play with. And I think that is really important to figure out how do you do that. And hopefully you do too, but if not, hopefully this has still been interesting as an insight into what is maybe the relationship between these sorts of procedural generation works and immersive theater, or how do you actually think about designing things for the real world. But hopefully this is maybe a little inspiration to go out and make some more weird stuff. Thanks. And I think we are just about out of time, but I think lunch is also after this, so I'll be around.